The wind over Lone Mesa carried the sound of loss. It hissed through cedar bones and hollow arroyos, brushing across the land like a ghost looking for somewhere to rest. Hale Rowan didn't believe in ghosts, but he lived like one, drifting from dawn to dusk, feeding horses, fixing fences, never talking to anyone but the wind. He'd built his cabin where the desert broke open into a bowl of red dust and sage, far enough from town to forget the sound of laughter, close enough to remember what he'd lost. Every morning he filled the tin pail, poured water for the horses, and stared into the horizon where the sun bled up like a wound. 3 years since the ambush at White Hollow. 3 years since the world took everything that made him human. He'd buried his wife and daughter in the dirt outside the cabin, 2 wooden crosses tilted by wind. And after that he'd made a vow: no more saving, no more touching, no more strangers. Then the scream tore across the canyon. It came from the east, sharp, desperate, echoing through stone. Not fear fury, a cry that refused to die. Hale froze mid-step, heart kicking against his ribs. Coyotes didn't scream like that, nor wolves. That was human. He grabbed his rifle. The horse was already restless, snorting against the reins. "Easy, girl," he murmured, swinging up. The wind was thick with sand as he rode toward the sound. The canyon narrowed. Dust turned to blood. He found her in the dry riverbed, one arm limp, leg torn, open skin, pale beneath streaks of crimson. Her eyes snapped open as his shadow fell across her. Dark eyes too steady for someone dying. He dismounted, kneeling beside her. "You alive?" She tried to move her lips. The word came out, broken: "Help." He tore the scarf from his neck, wrapped it tight around her thigh. Blood soaked through instantly. The wound was deep, claws, maybe teeth. Coyotes. He looked around, rifle up. The pack was gone, but not far. He lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than she looked, all sinew and will. Her breath fluttered against his collar. He could feel the tremor of her heartbeat too fast. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fallen like a curtain. The fire guttered in the hearth. As he kicked the door shut behind them, he laid her on the table where he used to skin game. Her skin burned under his hands. Fever already. He cleaned the wound with the last of his whiskey. She hissed, body arching, but didn't cry out. "Stay still," he muttered, stitching fast. When he finished, he wrapped her leg and stepped back. Her eyes were half closed, breath shallow. "You'll live," he said. She opened them again. "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter." Her lips curved faintly, a ghost of defiance. "Everything matters." He turned away before she saw how her voice unsettled him. He poured water into a tin cup, held it out. She drank greedily, then whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer. Outside, coyotes howled. Inside, the fire cracked, and Hale Rowan realized how long it had been since another heartbeat had filled the cabin. Aiyana woke to the smell of smoke and rain. Her wounds throbbed, but she could move her foot. The man who saved her sat by the fire, sharpening a knife with methodical strokes. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat jaw, set eyes gray and distant. "You could have left me," she said quietly. "I should have. Then why didn't you?" He didn't answer. He just set the knife down and stirred the coals. Sparks leapt, catching the edge of his scarred hands. She noticed then the faint tremor when he moved, the stiffness of someone who'd been alone too long. Outside, dawn painted the mesa in bruised gold. Aiyana pressed her palm to the dirt floor, whispering something under her breath. Hale caught the motion. "You praying, thanking," she said. "For what?" "For the earth. It held me when the wolves didn't." He frowned. "That's some Apache custom." She looked at him, unflinching. "It's called gratitude." The corner of his mouth twitched. Haven't had much use for that lately. Days bled into one another. She healed faster than he expected. Sometimes he found her by the window, staring at the ridgeline. Other times she helped with chores, hauling water, cleaning tools, mending what little she could reach. "You should rest," he'd tell her. "I rest when I'm dead," she'd reply. He admired her stubbornness, even when it terrified him. She carried silence like a shield. He caught her once tracing a scar along her arm, the mark of old rope. He didn't ask. She didn't offer. That night the rain returned, hard, relentless. The roof rattled. He checked the shutters while she stirred soup at the hearth. Her hands moved with ritual precision. "You've done this before," he said. "Survived storms, yes." "Not what I meant." She looked over her shoulder. "You think I've been saved before?" He hesitated. "You don't act like someone who needs saving. Neither do you." Lightning split the sky. For an instant her face glowed, beautiful, yes, but something older than beauty. A sadness carved by centuries. "They'll come for me soon," she said. "The ones I left. You run from your tribe, I ran from a cage. Did they hurt you?" She met his eyes. They wanted to own me. Same thing. Hale stared into the fire. Owning's not love. No, she murmured, but men keep confusing the two. Silence. Only the rain and the soft sound of soup bubbling. By midnight, the storm became a wall of noise. Wind screamed through the cracks, rattling every nail in the cabin. Hale moved to close the last window when lightning flashed and threw it a distant glint of torches down the ridge. He froze. Riders, he said. Aiyana was already standing. 5, maybe 6. You sure I know how many ghosts I left behind? He reached for the rifle. If they're your people, we can talk. They don't come to talk. Hale looked at her, saw something like apology in her eyes. You led them here, didn't you? Her jaw tightened. No, but I knew they'd follow me. The first shot cracked outside, hitting the doorframe. Wood splintered. The lamp fell flames spilling across the floor. Hale kicked dirt over it, heart hammering. Stay behind me, he barked. She didn't move. Give me a weapon. You can't even stand. Give me the damn gun. Hale. He tossed her the revolver. Another shot rang out, shattering the window. Wind howled through the hole. He aimed through the gap, fired once. A shadow fell outside. Then silence. Only the hiss of rain. Hale stepped forward, slowly peered out. Nothing but dark and water. When he turned back, Aiyana was gone. The door was open, swinging in the wind. He rushed out, calling Aiyana. No answer. Only hoofbeats fading into the storm. He followed the sound down the ridge mud, swallowing his boots. Through the rain, he saw them 5 riders at the creek, bed torches flaring. And her, standing among them, unbound, talking, calm. The sight hit him like a bullet. He raised his rifle. The wind howled around him, drowning his pulse. One of the riders laughed. She looked up straight toward him. Their eyes met. Lightning flashed. And in that light, Hale saw the truth. She wasn't captured. She led them there. The rain eased at dawn. Hale stayed on that ridge long after the riders disappeared. The storm's echo living in his chest, a low, aching hum that wouldn't stop. She'd led them there. No matter how he turned it in his head, that was the shape it took. By the time he got back to the cabin, smoke curled from the hearth. Aiyana stood by the fire, soaked and shivering her braid, dripping water onto the floorboards. She looked at him like she'd been waiting all night. You followed me, she said softly. You lied to me. His voice cracked like old wood. Yes. The word landed between them, heavy as a gun. He raised the rifle half an inch. Tell me why, before I forget I saved you. She didn't flinch. Because they weren't hunting me. He blinked, rainwater dripping from his hat brim. Come again. They came for you. Hale Rowan. You think I didn't know that name? She reached into her satchel and pulled something out, a tarnished badge. His old martial star. The one he'd buried the night he quit the world. I told them you were dead, she said. Showed them this to prove it. He lowered the rifle slowly. You knew about Abilene. Everyone knows. A marshal gone rogue hunting raiders until the blood blurred who was guilty. Her eyes softened. You killed the chief's son. They've been looking for the man who did it. He laughed once hollow. Guess they found him. I led them away, she said. They'll ride north thinking you're buried there. But I can't go back. Not after what I traded. Hale sank into the chair by the fire, the weight of her words pressing on him. You lied to save me. I lied to stop more dying. Something cracked open in him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the memory of what mercy felt like. He set the rifle aside. You could have told me. You wouldn't have believed me. She was right. They sat in silence, rain tapping the roof like hesitant fingers. For the first time, he saw the exhaustion in her. The bruises under her eyes, the tremor in her hand as she poured water. She'd risked everything for a man she barely knew. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You should go. They'll come back when they find out. Her voice was steady. Then we faced them together. That word together shook something deep. He looked up, saw her eyes on him, and for a heartbeat the world stopped spinning. Outside, dawn burned pale through the clouds. Steam rose from the soaked earth, smelling of iron and pine. The horses shifted restlessly in the corral, nostrils steaming. He stood, walked to the window. I buried that badge for a reason, he said. Wasn't planning on digging it up again. You don't have to, Aiyana replied. But they'll still come, and I won't run this time. He turned to her. You owe them nothing. I owe the dead, she said. Your name took a life from my people. My lie just bought you one back. He almost said thank you, but the words felt too small. Instead, he set his hat on the table and poured coffee for 2. They drank in silence while the fire crackled, and the wind shifted from west to south. The storm was breaking. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk cried thin and high as a knife in air. Aiyana sat close to the flame, wringing her braid over a tin basin. Her hair glistened black like wet obsidian. "You still don't trust me," she said. "I don't trust anyone who knows my past." "Then start with what's in front of you." She looked up, and the light from the fire caught the amber in her eyes. Not the ghosts. The rain had turned to mist by noon. They worked side by side, patching the roof where the storm had ripped the shingles loose. Hale held the ladder steady while Aiyana balanced barefoot on the beam, handing him nails from the pouch at her waist. She moved like someone born to the wind, sure like quiet. Once she laughed under her breath when he missed the nail and split his thumb. The sound startled him, not the pain, but the laugh itself. A brief sound of life after so much death. "Don't you ever get tired of saving people who don't ask for it?" she teased. "Don't you ever get tired of lying to people who would die for you?" He shot back. That shut her up for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Every lie I tell takes something from me, but some truths kill faster." By evening the sky cleared. A smear of sunset burned low over the mesa, turning the mud to amber. Hale sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle, watching her hang their wet clothes by the line. The way she moved, measured quiet, unafraid of being watched, reminded him how long it had been since someone else had walked these boards. "Where will you go if they ride back?" he asked. She paused, looked toward the distant ridge where the smoke of their pursuers had vanished. "I don't know. Maybe there is no place left for either of us. There's always somewhere," he muttered. "But it's never home." She turned then, the last light touching her cheekbones like copper. Maybe home isn't a place. Maybe it's just who you choose to stand with when the guns come back. He opened his mouth to answer, but the sound of hooves cut him off. One horse fast, coming from the north. He rose, rifle ready. Aiyana moved to his side, hand already on her knife. Through the twilight a rider appeared, slumped forward, his coat dark with blood. He fell from the saddle before the horse stopped. Hale was there in 3 steps, rolling the body over. A white badge gleamed on the man's vest, a federal inspector, the kind sent to hunt renegade marshals. In his hand he still clutched a paper, creased and wet with rain. Hale pried it loose. The ink bled, but one line was clear enough. Hale Rowan wanted alive. He looked at Aiyana. She was already watching him, face pale, jaw set. "You said you led them away." "I did." "Then what the hell is this?" "They don't stop," she said quietly. "Not for you, not for me. They hunt what they fear." The rider groaned, still alive. Hale knelt beside him. The man's eyes flickered open. "Abilene," he whispered. "She sent me." Hale's blood ran cold. Abilene, his sister's name, dead 10 years or so, he'd believed. The marshal's hand went limp. The paper slipped from his fingers, falling into the mud. Aiyana spoke first. "Who is Abilene?" Hale stared at the body. "Someone I should have buried twice." The night deepened around them, thick with crickets and wind. The hawk cried again from the ridge, as if calling witness. Aiyana stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "They won't stop coming, Hale." He nodded. "Then let them come." She looked at him, searching. "For what?" "For the truth," he said. "Even if it kills us." She held his gaze for a long moment, then lifted his hand and pressed it to the center of her chest. "Then we face it together," she repeated. The word no longer sounded like mercy. It sounded like a vow. Spring came late that year. The river swelled with snowmelt, carving the canyons deeper, dragging branches and half-buried stones down toward the desert basin. The current was loud, steady, like something ancient, reminding them that the world always starts over whether people do or not. Hale and Aiyana worked side by side, repairing fences, setting new posts where the storm had torn through the wire. It was easier to build than to talk. Wood and sweat didn't argue back. Each morning began with mist curling low across the pasture and ended in silence thick enough to hear the river breathing. Sometimes she'd hand him a nail without looking. Sometimes he'd steady a beam so she could tie it. Small gestures, wordless, but something was changing in the air between them, the way spring changes the smell of the land before it evergreens. Some nights when the wind softened and the sky burned orange, they sat outside by the corral. The horses shifted lazily, tails swatting at flies. Aiyana would hum songs he didn't know, slow, mournful melodies that carried more history than words could hold. Her voice moved like smoke through the dusk, low and sure. Hale would listen with his head tilted slightly, as if the sound itself might explain her better than her English ever could. "Those songs," he asked one night, "what do they say?" "They remind the earth we're still listening." She said, eyes on the horizon. "You think the earth cares?" She smiled faintly. Only about those who answer. He didn't understand, not really, but he liked the sound of her voice in the quiet. It filled spaces that had been hollow for too long. Once while she sang, he caught the faint scent of juniper in her hair, and it pulled a memory from him. A porch in Abilene, his sister, shelling beans in late summer, the sound of cicadas loud enough to drown thought. The ache that followed surprised him. He stared at the fire until his vision blurred. Aiyana noticed but said nothing. She only sang softer, as if she could hear the ghosts moving behind his ribs. That night when sleep came, it wasn't deep. He dreamed of gunfire again, the chief's son falling backward into red dust, the blood spreading like a river across sand. Then came the scream, not from memory, but real, sharp enough to cut the dark in half. He was beside her in seconds. She sat upright by the hearth, eyes wide, trembling. Sweat slicked her skin, though the cabin was cold. "Wolves again," she whispered. "I saw them in the firelight." Hale glanced at the door, at the rifle leaning nearby. Nothing but wind and night outside. "You're safe here," he said, voice rough from sleep. Her gaze darted toward him. "Are we ever?" He wanted to tell her yes, wanted to believe it himself. Instead, he brushed a hand over her shoulder, hesitant, uncertain if comfort was a thing he was still allowed to give. She didn't pull away. The fire hissed a log split. Her breathing slowed, but her question stayed between them like smoke. By the river the next morning, he caught his reflection trembling in the current. It looked like a stranger's face, scarred and sunburnt eyes that didn't belong to the man he'd been before Abilene. Aiyana came down from the ridge with a bundle of wet laundry. She saw him staring at the water and set the basket aside. "You blame yourself for killing him," she said. He didn't ask how she knew. "I blame myself for enjoying it." Her eyes searched his face, dark and clear as the river. "Then stop pretending you don't want to be forgiven." He turned the brim of his hat between his fingers. "Forgiveness doesn't bring the dead back." "No," she said softly, "but it brings the living forward." The wind caught her braid and lifted it across her shoulder. He wanted to answer but couldn't find words that didn't sound smaller than what she deserved. She knelt by the bank, wringing water from a shirt. The color of the river mirrored the name it carried, red though it wasn't blood, but the reflection of clay and sky. He watched the water run over her hands, over the cloth, and wondered how something that looked so gentle could cut stone in half. That evening they stood by the river as the sun went down. The air smelled of wet dust and cedar. The river glowed the color of copper. She stopped where the earth dipped, motioned for him to kneel. He hesitated, then obeyed. Without words, she reached for his hand and pressed it against the ground. "Now you thank the earth," she murmured. He swallowed. "For what?" "For letting us try again." Her palm was warm against his. He could feel the pulse in her wrist, steady, human, alive. Beneath his fingers, the earth thrummed faintly, as if something larger than both of them was listening. He didn't believe in her gods, not really, but in that moment he believed in her faith, in the strange courage it took to still be gentle after everything had burned. When she kissed him later that night, it wasn't sudden. It was the end of a long silence neither of them had wanted to break. The kiss was quiet, almost shy at first. Her lips tasted of smoke and river water. His hand found the back of her neck, fingers threading through the loosened strands of her hair. The world outside the cabin shrank to breath, and heart beat the rhythm of rain returning faintly on the roof. They didn't speak when they parted. She rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the slow, uneven beat beneath the scar tissue. He could feel her smile there, small but real. "Now you're listening," she whispered. After that night, the distance between them changed, not vanished, but softened like thawed ground. They worked as before, but their silences were warmer. When she laughed, he caught himself looking too long. When he spoke her name, she turned her head as if it meant something sacred. Days grew longer. The first wildflowers crawled up from the gullies. One morning she left a small bundle of sage on the windowsill tied with rawhide. "For smoke," she said. "To keep away bad dreams." He wanted to tell her that the bad dreams were all he had left of the people he'd lost. But instead, he burned the sage and watched the smoke twist into the rafters, smelling of bitter hope. Sometimes at dusk he'd see her standing by the river's edge, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the wind catching her dress. She'd close her eyes and whisper words he couldn't catch. It was prayer, he guessed, or memory. Once she motioned for him to come closer, took his hand and dipped his fingers into the water. "This is where my father swore his oath," she said. "By the Red River. He said every man must promise something to the land before the land lets him stay." Hale looked down at the mirrored surface, where the last of the sun burned like molten glass. And what did he promise? To protect it, she said simply, even from himself. He thought about that long after she'd gone inside. The current licked at his boots, cold and alive. He bent down, touched the surface, and whispered, "Then let me not become the storm again." That was the night he dreamed without blood, for the first time in years. The next day clouds rolled in from the south, heavy with thunder. They took shelter early. While she stirred stew on the stove, he mended a bridle by the fire. The wind howled through the chinks in the wall, and he said almost to himself, "You think the land ever forgives the ones who break it?" Aiyana looked up from the pot, eyes reflecting the flame. "The land doesn't forgive," she said. "It remembers. And when it gives you another season, that's its way of saying do better." He nodded slowly. Outside lightning flashed, splitting the sky into brief white bones. He thought of Abilene again, her voice on the day he left, telling him not to let justice rot into revenge. He hadn't listened then. Maybe he was listening now. When the rain finally stopped, they stepped outside together. The air was clean sharp with petrichor. The river had risen again, wild but shining under the newborn moon. Aiyana stood with her feet in the mud, head tilted to the sky. Every time it floods, she said, it takes a little of what hurt us and buries it downstream. He joined her, boots sinking. What if there's too much to bury? Then we build higher ground. They stayed like that for a long while, the wind lifting strands of her hair across his arm. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called and another answered. The world didn't feel empty anymore. By the time they returned to the cabin, the fire had burned low, the air thick with the smell of rain and wood smoke. Aiyana touched his sleeve before turning to her bedroll. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we start again." He caught her wrist. "What are we building this time?" She looked back at him, that small, knowing smile curving at the corner of her mouth. Something worth not lying about. He watched her cross the room, her silhouette framed in the glow of dying coals. For the first time since Abilene, Hale Rowan believed the world might still have room for mercy. Outside, the river whispered against the stones like a secret. Inside, he closed his eyes and listened as if the earth might finally answer. Summer brought no peace. Heat rolled through the canyons like breath from an unseen beast. And every dawn came with a sky the color of iron. The storms that spring had cleansed the land, but now the air hung dry, brittle, heavy with the scent of sage and dust. Even the birds seemed to vanish when the wind turned east. Rumors came first in whispers, traders stopping for water ranch hands passing through on their way to the forts. Words carried across the plains faster than horses. The tribe's war chief had sent men south hunting the trader woman and the ghost of a dead marshal. Hale said little, but the set of his jaw hardened. He doubled the perimeter, laid traps along the canyon's edge, and moved his rifle rack closer to the cabin door. Every sound seemed sharper. The groan of a pine bored the cry of a hawk overhead. They all felt like warnings. Aiyana worked beside him without complaint. She gathered herbs at dusk, dried meat over smoke, and sharpened knives until the edges caught the light like mirrors. They said almost nothing now. It was the silence of people who knew words could make fear real. Some nights, Hale woke to the sound of footsteps outside, the soft crunch of gravel under moccasins, or the shift of a branch too measured to be the wind. He would rise, barefooted, rifle in hand, and stand by the door until dawn bled gray across the horizon. Sometimes Aiyana joined him, her hair loose, her expression calm but unreadable. "They'll come," she said one night. He nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Ready is not the same as safe. He looked at her eyes, tired. "I stopped believing in safe a long time ago." The unease crept into every corner. Even the river seemed to run faster, as if trying to escape. One evening, when the sun sagged low and the horizon burned the color of raw copper, Hale caught a scent in the air, thick, acrid, unnatural. He stepped onto the porch. Smoke rose far off in the distance, curling like a serpent through the wind. Aiyana joined him, eyes narrowing. "Not thunderclouds," she said quietly. He didn't ask how she knew. She could read the land like a story already written. They ran across the clearing, past the field of half-grown corn, toward the ridge that overlooked the valley. The wind shifted and the smoke came thicker, blacker. Then they saw it, flames devouring the corral horses, screaming hooves pounding against the pen rails as fire ate the world around them. "They've found us," Hale said. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted downhill, cutting the ropes that bound the nearest gate. The horses burst through in a blur of muscle and terror, vanishing toward the river. Sparks rained like stars. He turned to Aiyana, thrust a rifle into her hands. "If they breach the cabin, shoot to live." She met his eyes. "No, we ride out. There's no time." "There's no life in dying inside four walls," she said fiercely. He almost argued, but the look in her face stopped him, the same defiant calm she'd worn the day he'd first found her bleeding in the snow. They fought their way through the smoke, choking eyes burning. Hale covered her with his coat as sparks whipped through the air. Bullets sang past the high whine of metal searching for flesh. Aiyana's braid caught fire, just a flicker, a ghost of flame, but he was on her in an instant, smothering it with his sleeve. "Go," he shouted, voice raw. She coughed, eyes watering. "You first." He grabbed her hand and they ran. Behind them, the cabin walls caught snapping and moaning as old wood surrendered to heat. From the ridge above, three riders appeared, dark shapes against the bleeding sky. They came fast, rifles flashing in the half-light. Hale dove behind a boulder, dragging Aiyana with him. The first shot ricocheted off the stone, spraying shards. He raised his rifle, sighted, and fired once. A rider pitched backward off his horse, disappearing into smoke. Another came from the flank. Hale dropped him with a clean shot through the chest. The third fired wild, a blind crack through flame and chaos. The bullet found flesh. Hale grunted, staggered, one hand clapping over his side. The sound that came out of him wasn't a scream, not yet, more like the air leaving something that had been standing too long. Aiyana caught him before he fell. Her fingers came away red. "Stay awake," she said, pressing her palm to his wound. "Stay with me." "Run," he rasped. "They'll circle back." "I'm done running." She rose, rifle steady in her hands. Her braid hung, half-burned eyes bright with fury. She fired once, twice, three times. The echoes cracked against the canyon walls. The last rider turned his horse, retreating into the smoke. When silence returned, it wasn't peace. It was exhaustion, thick and trembling. The corral was gone. The valley burned. The heat warped the air into ghosts. Aiyana half-dragged, half-carried him to the riverbank where the flames couldn't follow. He collapsed onto the sand, breath ragged. The water nearby hissed where sparks landed. "I told you," she whispered, pressing her palm harder against his wound. "You brought the dawn once. You can do it again." He tried to smile, failed. "If I die here, don't bury me with walls. You won't die." But they both knew he might. The night was long. She tore strips from her skirt to bind his wound, boiled river water with yarrow to clean it. The bleeding slowed, but the fever came quickly. He drifted in and out of sleep, muttering names she didn't know, Abeline, Morris, and Caleb. Ghosts of the life he'd never told her. When the sky turned violet, Aiyana sat beside him, knife in her lap, eyes fixed on the ridge. Every sound became a question, the crack of a twig, the whisper of wind. She felt the land breathe differently now, tense and watchful. She prayed not to the gods of her childhood, but to the fire itself, to the part of the world that destroyed, so something else could grow. By midday, Hale woke. His lips were dry, skin pale. "Water," he murmured. She lifted his head, gently brought the canteen to his mouth. He drank, coughed, and blinked. "How bad?" "Bad enough," she said. He managed a ghost of a grin. "I've had worse." "Liar," he chuckled weakly. "Maybe." She tore another strip of cloth, replaced the bandage. His hand caught hers midway. "Why stay?" She frowned. "You think I'd leave?" "I think everyone leaves eventually." "Then you've been around the wrong people." For a moment their eyes locked, and he saw something he hadn't before, not pity but faith, the kind that doesn't ask permission to exist. By the third day, the fire had burned itself into silence. The land lay black and skeletal. Smoke still drifted in ribbons from the charred trees. Aiyana scouted the hills, moving like a shadow through the ash. She found two horses alive down by the lower creek, one limping, one strong enough to carry them both. When she returned, Hale was sitting up, pale but stubborn. "You're supposed to be resting." "Resting's for the dead," he said. She rolled her eyes, helped him to his feet anyway. His weight leaned heavy against her shoulder, but he refused to look weak. They saddled the horse, packed what little survived the rifle, a small pouch of dried meat, and the map she'd drawn by hand. As they rode from the ruined valley, Hale looked back once. The cabin was gone, the corral nothing but twisted iron and ash. The river still moved red and relentless. "That was home," he said quietly. "It still is," Aiyana replied. "Fire doesn't take that away." They rode for 3 days without rest, keeping to dry creek beds and narrow passes. Hale's wound reopened twice. She stitched it under moonlight hands, steady, even when he cursed through his teeth. "You sew like a soldier," he said. "My mother taught me," she murmured. "She said a woman should know how to mend what men destroy." He winced as the needle bit flesh. Smart woman. She was. The fourth night, thunder rolled over the plains, distant but moving closer. They made camp in the ruins of an old mission. Stone walls cracked but still standing. Rain came slow, steady, washing the soot from their skin. Aiyana built a fire in the old altar pit, its smoke curling through the broken roof. Hale sat across from her, watching the flame dance in her eyes. "You ever think it ends?" he asked. "What, the running? The fighting?" She looked into the fire. "Everything ends. Even storms?" He shook his head. "Not for me. Then you haven't seen enough dawns." They didn't speak after that. The rain drummed on the stone. For a moment it sounded like forgiveness. By dawn, Hale's fever had broken. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, shirt plastered to his back, staring at the east. Smoke still lingered far away, a thin thread rising from what had been their home. Aiyana joined him, wrapping a blanket over his shoulders. "You should eat." "Can't," he said. "Not yet. Then talk. Sometimes that feeds the soul." He sighed. "I was 20 when they gave me that badge. Thought I could fix the world if I shot fast enough. Then came Abilene. She wanted me to lay the badge down before it turned me to iron. I didn't listen. By the time I did, she was already gone." Aiyana watched him carefully. "She was your wife, my sister," he said quietly. "They said the raiders took her. Truth is, I did. My rage did. I became the thing I swore to fight." Silence settled like ash. She stepped closer. "You can still choose what you are." "Can I?" "Yes. The land forgives slower than people, but it still forgives." He met her gaze. The storm clouds had broken behind her, streaks of sunlight turning her hair to bronze. "You sound like a preacher." "No," she said softly. "Just someone who's buried enough to know what to save." By the 7th day, Hale could walk without bleeding. They followed the Red River north, hoping to reach the old mining town of Ransom Creek, where traders might hide them. But every mile carried signs they weren't alone. Hoofprints, too fresh, smoke on the horizon, the faint echo of drums in the distance. One night they stopped at a canyon rim overlooking the plains. Below, the world glowed faintly with scattered fires, signals or camp lights. It was hard to tell. Hale watched them like a man studying fate. "They won't stop," he said. "Then neither will we. You don't understand. They think you betrayed them, and I killed one of their own." Aiyana touched his arm. "The fire took what was. Now we decide what comes next." He looked down at her hand, then at her face, tired, streaked with soot but unbroken. "You still believe that?" She nodded. "Because if I don't, then the fire wins." That night they slept close, the river's whisper beneath the cliff. Hale dreamed of smoke again, but this time it didn't choke, it carried voices. Abeline's faint but clear, "Let her guide you home." When he woke, Aiyana was gone. Panic flared. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his side. Then he saw her on the riverbank below, kneeling by the water, her hands cupped, as if offering something invisible to the current. He limped down. "What are you doing?" "Making an oath," she said. "For both of us." "To what?" "To the fire that comes. It burns everything, but it gives back light. You promised once you'd never die behind walls. Then promise this too. If we survive, we live without fear." He hesitated, then knelt beside her. The morning light turned the water gold. He placed his bleeding hand into the current beside hers. "I promise," he said. Their blood mingled with the river's red silt, vanishing downstream. Aiyana smiled faintly. "Now the land knows your word." He stared at her, realizing that whatever came next, revenge, redemption, ruin, they were bound now not by fear or pity, but by that small, defiant act of belief. The fire had come for them once. It would come again, but next time they'd be the ones bringing it. The night dragged into gray. Hale drifted in and out, every breath sharper than the last. Aiyana stayed by his side, washing the blood away, whispering the same words she spoke to the earth. When his eyes opened, he found her watching him. "You praying for me, I'm talking to the land. It listens better than God's." He smiled weakly. "Then tell it I'm sorry." "For what?" "For not coming inside sooner." She laughed through tears. "You stubborn fool." He reached up, cupped her cheek with a trembling hand. "When I'm gone, don't follow. I can't stay here without you." "Yes, you can. You're stronger than this place." He coughed, crimson blooming across his chest. She pressed harder, trying to stop the bleeding. "Hale, look at me." He did. And in that moment, the fear left him. "You were right," he whispered. "The earth remembers those who answer." "Then answer it," she pleaded. He took her hand, placed it on the ground beside his. "Don't come inside until the sun does," he said. "Promise me." Tears fell on his skin. "I promise." He smiled faintly. "Good." And when the first light of dawn broke over the ridge, Hale Rowan exhaled one last time. The world went still. Aiyana sat there, long after the sun climbed the sky, her hand still on his, the warmth fading from his fingers. Weeks passed. The land began to heal before she did. Grass grew where ash had fallen. The cabin stood half-burnt, but not gone. Aiyana buried him on the ridge overlooking the river where the first light always touched. She marked the grave not with a cross but with a circle of stones and a single feather. Every morning she rose before dawn, pressed her palm to the soil and whispered thank you. The world was quieter now. Sometimes she'd hear horses in the distance, travelers, traders, but she never went to meet them. She had everything she needed here, wind, earth, memory. One evening she sat by the fire, tracing the pattern of Hale's badge in her hand. She'd kept it, cleaned it, polished it until it gleamed like sunrise. When she held it up, the reflection caught her face, half shadow, half light. You found me, she said softly into the air. And I refused to let you stay lost. Outside, the wind carried his name across the mesa. At dawn, she walked to the ridge. The first light broke, scattering across the land. She placed the badge atop his grave, beside a sprig of desert sage. The wind lifted her hair, tangled it with the light. You brought the dawn home, she whispered. And as the sun climbed higher, it seemed to answer. The light spilled down the ridge over the stones, over the land they'd fought for, turning the ashes gold. Aiyana closed her eyes, pressed her hand to the earth one last time, and for the first time since his death, she smiled. Because the dawn wasn't gone. It was right there, breathing beneath her palm.
Your horse is not lost. If you...
Cowboy cried when his horse was bitten by a snake, until an Apache woman said, I have a cure. The desert did not breathe so much as it listened, and in that listening a man could hear his own ruin. Heat lifted off the red rock like a fever you couldn't break, and the sky was a hard, pitiless blue that made the eyes ache. I had ridden too far on too little, counting the slosh in a skin that had forgotten generosity, telling myself one more mile, one more rise, one more lie a man can use to keep moving. The saddle creaked the way old bones do when they remember what it cost to stand. Cole, my gelding, the color of burned stone, took each step like he owed me, and I hated that I let him. I was 42 and tired of the arithmetic of survival, water, shade, distance, and the weight of names I no longer said out loud. The war had not only carved a seam across my shoulder, it had scooped something out of the center of me and left a hollow where prayer used to live. I told myself I was done with banners, done with orders, done with men who spoke about glory with clean boots. But a man can be done and not yet free. And a man can love a horse more honestly than he ever learned to love his own voice. We turned under a lip of stone where the shade fell in a narrow ribbon, a mercy as thin as a promise. Cole's ears pricked, then pinned. The sound came like dry beans spilled in a tin mechanical, sure, alive. I didn't see the rattler so much as feel the decision it made. The strike was a flicker and a thud. Cole screamed a ripped cloth sound that reached into my chest and tore something loose. He lunged and dropped. Dust boiled around us. I was on my knees before I knew I'd moved, my hands on his neck, my mouth saying, easy, easy. Like language could bargain with poison. 2 punctures bloomed above the fetlock, already swelling, already turning the color a man's eye refuses. Veins climbed like black roots under the hide. I'd seen death wear that pace before. A boy in a camp had reached for what he thought was a dog. We buried him before dawn. I pressed Cole's head into my lap, and the tears came the way. A storm comes to country that's begged for rain and forgotten how to receive it. Don't leave me, I said, and the words shocked me because they were true and small and stripped of the armor I had worn since the bugles went quiet. A voice answered, not mine, not God, not anything I'd admit to if you leaned on me in a saloon. A woman's voice, low and steady, a melody that seemed made from the same fibers as the wind. I blinked grit and grief away and turned. She stepped out of the rock shadow, as if she'd been carved there by the same patience that made the mesas. Young, yes, but with the kind of stillness you don't get without burying a teacher and learning to go on. Her hair was braided with bits of color that caught the light. Her dress carried the geometrics of a people who remembered more than